Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Largresti, and I'm here with Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder and chief academic officer at Newsela, where he and his team are bridging gaps in K-12 education in part by providing articles from reliable sources that are adjusted for different reading levels, which empowers teachers to engage students while also meeting diverse literacy needs. I know as a teacher, I use this product all the time, and so I'm really excited to be talking with you, Dan.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Olivia.
Well, I would love to just kind of get started and, share a little bit more about yourself and about Newsela. And so I'm curious, kind of looking back, I know Newsela filled a really important content gap for K-12 schools. And so I wanted to just, mention today we're seeing a huge explosion of just edtech tools in general. So curious how your perspective on the role of technology in education may have evolved since you've actually co-founded Newsela.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because I think in some ways it has, and in some ways it's sort of some of my earliest notions have been reinforced. So prior to Newsela, my job was basically to review products, hardware, software, and different learning models. It's sort of the early days of flipped classrooms and when Chromebooks were making their entry. And I think one of the things that I was always mindful of when I was looking at the technology and its use in the classroom was whose job is it to do what? When the technology enters the learning space in whatever context, and I was looking at products in elementary, middle, and high across subject areas, mostly in math and literacy. What does the product think its job is? Where does what's the water's edge in terms of like where it thinks that's the teacher's job? And naturally, the teacher comes into this sort of like teacher-student software or hardware technology with their own notion of that. And the student comes in with their own. And usually, for the most part, the student is the receiver of this. They're told, like, your job is to do X. And when these things come in conflict, it's pretty jarring for the teacher when the software starts to do something that the teacher feels is their job. Or conversely, doesn't do something the teacher feels is the software's job. And so some like very typical examples of this are sort of playlists. I remember looking at two math products in elementary grades back in like 2013, 2012 even. And one of the challenges in working with the teachers who were, let's say second, third, fourth grade, working with their students is they would get on the sort of playlist of the math product, and they would sort of disappear into their own world. And by intent, that was what the software wanted them to do, and move at their own pace and so on, personalized learning. And then the teacher was trying to figure out, like, okay, how does that intersect with what we're doing as a class, like the 20 of us in a more social learning environment that's not one-to-one. And sometimes it would, intersect in joyful ways, like there would be a teacher would ask the student would say something sitting on the rug, and they would say something that the teacher hadn't introduced, and the teacher around a concept they hadn't gotten to yet. And the teacher would say, well, how do you know this? Like that's they sort of like look of surprise. And, oh, well, in this case, Gigi told me, the penguin. And the teacher was like, oh, and they take that in very high regard. Like, wow, there's really something powerful here when that transfer jumps from one-to-one computer-based to this setting, because now other students are hearing the student say this and seeing the teacher's reaction and so on. But in other cases, like an example from Newsela is, I resisted very strongly for a long time. As you say, we published authentic materials at multiple reading levels. And one of the things that I resisted was the idea that we would lock a student at a reading level the way other products that I had seen would do, because it seemed to me that the product was operating beyond its remit and sort of saying, I know that Dan is a seventh grade level reader, and everything he sees is going to be at a seventh grade level. One, that wasn't backed up by research. You're a different reader for many things that you read. And two, it was asserting understanding of a context in the classroom that it just could never have had. Like it was something that the teacher could know, and perhaps the student metacognitively could learn what level reader they were over time and take that and work with it. But there was, like, to me, a sort of a jarring experience where if the software is asserting this and the student's like, no, this is not, I'm not seventh grade on this. I've been reading about baseball or gardening for, 5 years. I'm obsessed with it. it sort of breaks the spell of what the software is trying to do. And so I guess this is a long answer, but to say, like, I see that happening again. And that was one of my earliest impressions. And I see that happening. We can talk about ways that that's happening, but my perspective on the role of the technology in some ways is very similar to where it was like 10 or 15 years ago, though the technology has advanced incredibly since then.
Yeah, that's interesting. So almost like, we're reverting back in certain ways to, there are so many products that I think, to your point, I loved how you mentioned, like, what does the product think its job is? And I think that's a really important perspective for teams out there to be considering. And something you mentioned about, I like how you have not locked students into certain reading levels. I think about, so much of, for students, a lot more than I think we previously understood has to do with how a student perceives themselves. So if they view themselves as a student who, we talked about, we had students who were in the red in school where they had their homework grades were in the red. And so then students start to perceive themselves as a student who's in the red. They don't really view themselves, or it's harder to, I think, break out of that. So I think, to your point, giving students that ability to view these levels while there's scaffolding that's important. They're not necessarily locked in. And I love how, especially, when you get that kid who doesn't want to be in school and then all of a sudden you find that one topic they can be an expert in, it completely changes their role in the classroom. They're no longer the kid who is, failing every test, but they're the one who's teaching everyone about dinosaurs or about roller coasters or something really unique. So I love how you're kind of allowing students to be tap into that subject matter expertise that they can bring.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super important. It's a sense of belonging and, like, what do I bring? Who am I in school? What do I bring to this? And how does school recognize me as an individual? How does my teacher recognize me? How do I become known? What's my reputation, so to speak, academically or otherwise? Just like, who am I in this classroom? Just to go back to that example, like, I also want to sort of land the point here that we've learned too that we can't just it's not enough. We're not doing enough of the job if we say to a teacher, well, you give the article in Newsela, we'll offer it at the level we think that's right for them, but they can change it. Teachers don't want that all the time. They're on an assignment by assignment basis, again, because they have context that we don't. They want the ability to lock a level because they are using that content for a particular purpose. And to go back to the very beginning of this, like, that's, I think, fundamentally, like, my understanding, as long as we're working in classrooms, my understanding is we have to be hyper aware of what it means to work in a classroom. And we have to be mindful of the context in which we're being used, and not sort of co-develop that division of responsibility with teacher, student, and us and software. And for us, I think we see a progression over time. I mentioned metacognition, like, the student becomes aware of how they think, where they're strong, where they're weak, where they need to work harder. And they own that. They own their identity as a learner over the years in school. So they can begin to make those choices for themselves. But it's a scaffolded process, and the teacher is essential. You would misuse Newsela if you just gave it to your kids and said, go do Newsela. I'll be over there. You go do Newsela. That's, independent reading is great, but that can't be the only way that you use it, because that's not going to be effective.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, just to consider that. And I think, I want to think about, kind of continue to dive into that student experience and the teacher's role specifically, and how they're choosing products. And I'm curious, how does this perspective, and your kind of role in supporting teachers in creating and helping students meet their form their identity as a learner, how does that inform the way that you approach the product development, either of new products, within Newsela, or the overall strategy of the whole kind of suite of tools, especially at a time when teachers are so overwhelmed by technology choices? I know that, there are so many tools out there, but there's only so many a teacher can learn and embrace. So how do you kind of think about that when you're considering product development?
Yeah, I think it's maybe an extension of that sort of shared roles and context question. Is that you got to integrate, and you got to be thinking integration all the time. How is what we are asking the teacher or student to do or administrator integrate into what they're currently doing? We can't show up as though it's day one of school ever having existed. There's habits and procedures, processes. Some are preferred and some are just required that we have to integrate with. That goes for technical integration and also workflow integration. So one practical way that we think about this is, I often talk about our pieces of content as sort of like free floating atoms. They're just like out there. There's now, 17,000 and counting pieces of content of all shapes and sizes. And they coalesce, and you can form them into sort of molecules and have them be topically aligned and be a cluster that's like a text set. And that's all well and good, but really it's most powerful when it's actually aligned to the scope and sequence and the curriculum. Newsela, I'll often say, is not a curriculum. We're not striving to be one, but we know that curricula are not sufficient unto themselves. There's usually a gap in the content between the relevance, accessibility, which leads to sort of missed opportunities for engagement. And we think we play a meaningful role there, the way that our educators use us to take the scope and sequence, take the sort of spine of their curriculum, and we will help align our content to that spine. And so the integration is tighter and not as happenstance, and is strategic so that they know the topics where they really want to let their students go deep, and they can find content from Newsela that complements that. But we're not there to tell them what's next. We're there to make the what's next easier, more engaging, and so on. And I think that's true at multiple elevations. So there's in each classroom, then there is sort of in the abstract across teaching and learning in classrooms. And then I think there's also integration into district strategic planning and how districts are thinking about what the outcomes are that they're striving for. And I think that's sort of a critical point of alignment and integration that we have valued over the years, and really turned a lot of our energy to be very deliberate in demonstrating what are the modes of use in which you can expect to get the outcomes in literacy, for example, that you're striving for. And you tell us your strategic plan, and we'll make sure you understand how to use us, what good looks like, with what frequency, and how would you know walking into a classroom, and then what's the data going to show, and how is that going to roll up year over year. I think especially because they're overwhelmed by technology choices, not just teachers, but admins, especially with the expiration of ESSER funds, they have to make hard choices, and the customers we're working with get that. And we're very deliberate about laying out that integration for them.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, a product knowing what its job is. I love how you said that, understanding that you're not the curriculum, but that you do fill an important gap. I know, as a science teacher, when I was trying to prepare lessons for both a 12 to 1-to-1 classroom and an ICT classroom for the same day, there were some topics that, some kids got that others didn't, or just, a lesson I needed to revisit where, while I may have had a robust curriculum, we needed a review day. And so Newsela was a really useful tool for me to just kind of, revisit a topic, or just create more engagement or excitement around topics that I wanted to dive into. And I know that a while back I was listening to something you mentioned, that when you were first starting out, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that you were actually directly emailing teachers that you were working with who were signing up just to ask them their opinions. And I think that from what I've seen, that really shows in how you're kind of fitting into a teacher's, the variety of teacher schedules, but what their day-to-day looks like.
Yeah, for sure. We had this email that we would all get that would give us a list of all the teachers who'd registered that day. And it would come out at midnight. And so I would be on my computer waiting for the email. And then I'd send an email to if there were two teachers from the same school, two or more, I would send them an email. And I remember people writing, and they would write back because I think it was a kinder, gentler time when people didn't get so many freaking emails. They would actually respond. They still do, but there was something really sweet about the interactions that I could form with teachers there, because we would really just be writing about, tell me what you're up to, and what you're doing. And I stayed in touch with a lot of those teachers over the years, some of the earliest points of contact that I have, which is harder now. As you mentioned, there's just so much going on. I think,
Definitely. And I think it's really, important that it sounds like as you're understanding the teacher's role more, you can then form the product's role to, I wouldn't say, I would say to fit and complement that. And I wanted to, I think, bring our conversation a little bit, a lot of what we're thinking about and what I've spent my time thinking about, especially, is really what the role is for a teacher in this age of AI, and how products can really support that teacher in that space. And so I'm curious, as we're kind of thinking about a future forward, how do you think that you ensure that AI is being used on the Newsela team to genuinely transform learning, rather than just being this buzzword or a tool that schools might purchase, thinking about all the things that they're considering with ESSER funds, but then might not be able to actually implement effectively?
yeah, I think there's definitely a tension between I think the pressure everybody feels to understand and keep their understanding current with what is AI, where's it headed, what can it do today that it couldn't do yesterday. And so, yeah, we have to be careful. And then I think this gets to some of the first question is what are how's my thinking changed and maybe stayed the same with regard to tech in classrooms. I'm still wary, as I was years ago, of the sort of tech forward or tech first point of entry. This is in the classroom because it can do a thing, and not necessarily because we have a problem that we're trying to solve, or we understand what the gap is. But we have a new technology, and now it's here because it's everywhere. It also belongs in our classroom, and I think that can be just it's not necessarily a problem straight up, but it creates all kinds of distractions at a time when you really need to focus on student learning and outcomes, where things aren't well defined. I think some of the ways to think about how to use AI is, I would say first and foremost, don't rush, right? Identify specific use cases and see for yourself how well the AI can fulfill those. If we're talking about AI and core instruction, if you wanted to do AI as a club, or AI as a sort of supplement in a dedicated time and space where you don't need precious minutes for direct instruction or for learning or for core subject areas, then that's a great way to experiment. But I think you kind of need a place where you can incubate, and then you need to be very judicious about how you put it in play within instruction. One study that I read a little while ago, that I hope, though, is the first of what I hope will be more, is a way of a series of interviews over the course of a year that a group from University of Michigan did with, I think it was 24 teachers, just comparing how the AI in the hands of these teachers who were relatively new to its use. They contrasted the idea of seeking input versus seeking output from the AI. And they found that seeking input, that is asking the AI to generate different alternatives and alternative approaches to how could I teach something, how could I assess something, versus seeking output, can you make 50 of these if I give you the first couple. The input was more effective, more efficacious for the teachers, their own self-reported productivity. They felt they were sort of more productive. They could think more effectively through some of the instructional challenges they were having. And I think that is an interesting idea to use the AI in that case, where it's like a discussant, an interlocutor, or something you can have a dialogue with and ask questions and get it to tell you some of its thinking around a topic that you give it. as opposed to like sort of using it as a sophisticated photocopier. It can do that as a time saver, but it may not be the most impactful for for the amount of time you spend on it. So I think as with most things, you have to kind of have a good sense of what your use case is. What is it that you're trying to solve? If you're going to use it in the classroom instructionally, like in your own time, there's all kinds of, zany things you can do, which are great and playful and so on. But I think you just have to be careful that in core instruction, those minutes are precious. Teachers know this, but as someone and myself who's prone to distraction, maybe this is just me talking to myself, but like I got to differentiate like serious work from playtime, and not let the two get too intermingled in a way that just like doesn't result in much.
Yeah, I think that's a great I'm also prone to distraction. So I think just even providing that framework for how we do things, that it's not just, there is I think the best advice when it came to all these tools was kind of to play around with them. And while I still agree with that there's nothing better than just getting your hands dirty and trying it out, but having a framework and a mindset for how you're doing that so that it's a little bit more intentional sounds really, really useful. And I think that some of that, does come down to really thinking critically and kind of doing, what you're trying to get out of these tools, asking the right questions. And I think that that's something that many schools are actually concerned about specifically, is that, AI might replace critical thinking or creativity, especially when it comes to writing. And so I'm curious if you could speak to, what you think the responsibility of ed tech companies is in this place to see that AI really augments rather diminishes these skills in our students.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question. I think creativity. It's sort of depends on how you want to think about creativity. Let's just say, let's take something. We've been working on a writing product called Newsela Writing that uses AI, and I think one of the things that we're mindful of and aware of, and I'm a former high school English teacher, is that students can struggle with, let's just say, argumentative writing, making an argument and supporting it with evidence. In next generation science standards, the claim evidence reasoning frame, or in social studies, the document-based questions. You need to find evidence for your argument, and you need to explain how the evidence relates. And just that basic structure is enough for students to really have some challenges with. And you want creativity, but it's like I can't teach you to improvise if you don't know scales. It may sound like the musician is playing all kinds of notes in random order, but that's not without a great deal of training, right? Jackson Pollock didn't just start splattering a canvas. He is a very talented and more traditional artist before he went much more experimental. And I think as a teacher, one of the things I'm probably guilty of is like overemphasizing. First, I would say, having not been taught how to teach writing, but having been taught to write, but not how to teach it, I had to make up how I was going to teach writing. And I applied my own sensibilities as to the ones that had been applied to my writing in graduate school and as an undergrad and in high school. And a lot of it came down to things that were very hard to define, and they weren't well structured. And when I tried to communicate these to my students, I was talking about things like how a sentence sounded and what is the voice. And for a student who's looking for just let me get my bearings, AI and a kind of a set of rules that I can enforce fairly routinely, it's in a sustainable, scalable way, can do a lot of great work. It's not going to turn average writers into artists in writing, but in our way of thinking, like, what if every student could get a B? They could write B-level papers, and the teacher could take them from a B to an A in a way that the AI can't. And I'm not talking about creative writing, just in argumentative, literary analysis, writing from a source. Like, that's kind of our approach there. So we don't want to replace it, but we know that students need a lot of at-bats, right? Like, one of the things that I learned very early was that if the only writing that my students did was the writing that I read. There was no way they were going to write enough. So that put me in a bind where I couldn't read everything they were going to write, but they needed to write more. And I felt guilty that I couldn't, but that was the fact of it. And they needed timely, specific feedback. And at the time, there really wasn't a good mechanism for this. But I think that's the AI. The value of the AI is with some constraints, some rules, it can apply those rules more and more intelligently. And if you can get students to a point where they start to build confidence in themselves, when you assign writing, they feel like, okay, I know what this is about. I have a structure. I have a schema in my mind of how I'm going to attack this because I've had a lot of at-bats. There's a structure, a sort of a strike zone for me as a pitcher that I can picture. I can see it, even if it's not actually in front of me. Then you've unlocked writing, in a way that like was never possible before. And yeah, there's always room to grow and to stretch. And that's, I think, going back to, whose job is it? I think that's really the teacher's job more than it is the AI. And ultimately it's got to be the students, right? But even, writers have editors. So we know it's not just a solo endeavor.
Yeah. And I like how you are speaking to the student's mindset, that's something that we focus so much on skills. And I think that is incredibly important, but a student's mindset when they, sit down in front of a piece of paper or an assignment or whatever it is, and what they go into is so impactful. I think that really does speak to just improving their kind of emotional attitudes through actual instruction or instructional support is really important. And I think that, speaking of places where students can feel stressed, I think that, assessments are definitely a place where I saw a lot of testing anxiety from some of my students, even who are strong performers, and we thinking about kind of the best ways to really understand where a student is in their performance levels. And so I think that where we see a lot of this when it comes to instruction is with personalized learning and thinking about, many different products that are trying to leverage that. But I think that there's also the argument that assessments haven't really caught up to this. And so I'm curious how you believe that assessments really need to evolve to actually reflect kind of personalized learning outcomes and maybe any obstacles you see holding that back.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think there's a lot at stake. I think increasingly, assessments are kind of where it's at. And they deserve a great deal of attention because you kind of get what you measure. And I think assessments are holding us back. So like to date, what I've seen in terms of software and products, digital products, is that they've been in they've worked successfully in three areas. And for similar reasons. So in early literacy, the so-called learning to read, math, and language acquisition, like world languages. So like Duolingo or any of the math products. Let's just say Khan Academy initially, and like some of the early literacy products. Each of these, it's possible to sort of map the domain. Khan Academy, for a long time, they did away with it, which broke my heart, but they had a Google map of math. And I'm not like a math expert. I wasn't a math instructor, but I loved being able to see a domain mapped in terms of a sort of spider web of dependencies to help the learner understand where they were relative to the domain. You're here, and if you're having trouble with this concept, we're going to push you to go in this direction because we think building the background for where you are now comes from, if you don't know multiplication, I'm making this up, you don't know multiplication, time for more addition practice. I have no idea if that's pedagogically sound, but just for example, like that was great for me to be able to think of like a domain, to hold that image of a domain in my head, because background knowledge in non-math areas is such a, it's like 5-dimensional chess. It's very hard to get a clear map of. But when you can see in like things like language acquisition, products like Duolingo, you can see a progression. And if you are on a progression and it's mapped, you can code against that. You can write rules, if-then statements, and know what to show a learner when. And that comes down to assessment, right? You need to know where they are. So you can constantly just like assess them constantly from all different perspectives in those three domains: early learning, math, and world language. And software in other areas has not been as successful. And I think in part that's because the assessment challenge has been the burden. You couldn't fulfill it because you had a limited way. You'd only assess effectively in a limited number of domains and in a limited number of methods. And obviously, for Duolingo, not being able to fully languages are meant to be spoken, and if you can't assess spoken language, then you're missing a whole dimension. And I know they're working on that. I think this is sort of like the bleeding edge here. If we want to fulfill some of the promise of personalized learning, is to embrace a more comprehensive set of tools to enable the same level of sort of comprehensiveness that teachers have when they're trying to fully assess a student. If they really want to get to the bottom of what Dan knows, they're going to do much more than multiple choice to find the answer to that. Teachers do all of these, oral presentations, discussions, writing, of course, and other things, but they're not sustainable at scale. You can't do it as often as you want for every student as much as you would want. And so there's some power in technology where I think the evolution in that direction with being able to automate trustworthy measures of multiple forms of expression, that's pretty exciting. One of the stats that comes to mind in this context is a company called TeachFX, who, with agreement with educators, listen to voices in classrooms. And they published this stat that has stuck with me ever since I read it, is that after listening to however many hundreds of thousands of hours of classroom instruction, they could tell that for the average student, in the average hour of teacher-led instruction, the student only heard their own voice 7 seconds per hour. And if we think that students speaking is a form of, synthesizing and expressing knowledge that we want to hear, 7 seconds, not to mention the students' disengagement with learning, but there's just not, how are you going to do that? So writing is great, right? Because everyone can write at the same time. But the technologies that could help us rethink assessment, I think, are just arriving.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think, going back to a couple of things you mentioned, this is not a math test. So speaking of assessments, we can glaze over any kind of mathematical dependencies. But I do think that I love that your kind of thought here about helping students kind of understand where they are within their learning experience. I know that, even when I was teaching science specifically, students always questioned me when they had a lot to read. And they always said, this is science class, why are we reading? And so we talked a lot about that reading is this, skill that kind of goes across all subjects. And so just giving them that why was so important to their instruction. And I think that when it comes to assessments, students also sometimes have those questions. How is this helping me? And I think that teachers as well. I don't think that, we don't want to spend lots of time assessing students unless there is going to be a benefit to that. And so I think that, to your point, assessments are a bit broken at this point, and there is a lot that can be done to really ensure that students, that they're more effective. And so I'm curious kind of how you and your team are actually rethinking the concept of an assessment, if AI has a role there, and how we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, I think so. The most valuable assessments are formative assessments, and any assessment could be used formatively or summatively. But if you take the measure of someone's understanding of something and then you just sort of take it and walk away, you're not really giving anything back to them for the time and effort that they spent in trying to demonstrate what they know and can do. You give them a grade, maybe they get some comments, but it doesn't fold into what they do next. And obviously life is made up of summative events. So you finish a grade level and maybe things don't carry over to the next grade, but I think we miss a lot of opportunities in the way that classroom learning is structured today, where the assessments, the summative assessments, don't roll over. They don't move there isn't like an accumulation or an interplay and a carrying forward of, well, what did we learn from the last, what's missing, or what are we going to build on from the last unit or from the last assessment that we did. So part of the rethinking, if you want to call it that, is just to drive home the incredible value of formative assessment. And there's some great examples of how districts that we're working with are really leveraging the power of formative assessments through basically a very sort of like old-fashioned backwards mapping. Is basically planning backwards from what proof would we expect, or what would we accept as proof that a student knows and can do what we're asking, or what the standard is asking them to do, and then what are we going to do? How are we going to get that student to be able to demonstrate this? And then once we've asked them, and once we've assessed them, like, what are we going to do with the students who need more help and the students who are ready for acceleration? And just that taking your end of course exam or your end of course assessment and just backwards mapping it to periodic common formative assessments. And common is really important here because you want to have a discussion. Like, this is the work of teachers, to be very clear, like, not the software's work, but the work of teachers is to knowing what they know about their kids and seeing what the data is telling them about their understanding at that point in time in a timely way. Like, compare notes and compare plans that they might make for individuals or groups of students. The charter school network I used to work at, we had so-called data days. Like, every 6 weeks, the schools would literally close for a day. I think it may have wreaked havoc on home life, but they got a day where they were basically like, okay, now what? So on Friday, there was an assessment. Monday is a data day. And Tuesday, that information is being put into use. And we're reorienting our approach for each of our kids and groups of kids. I think that is, I don't know if it's so much a rethinking, but it's, it can have transformative effects. And it can really enable ownership of assessment at the classroom level and even at the student level. That I think right now, at least when I was teaching, assessment felt to me like something I had to do, wasn't necessarily something that I owned, and was sometimes, in some ways, perhaps being used to judge me. So it was being mandated from on high. And I think assessment is actually a place where classrooms and district offices actually can meet really productively to the benefit of kids and parents.
Yeah, that's a great point. Again, always understanding the why. What is the purpose of those assessments? And it's interesting to hear about that adjusted school schedule. I have lots of thoughts on how school schedules could be changed or a bit creative, but all would end up being, wrecking some havoc. But I think that that's a really good point to consider, and I think supporting teachers in having that ownership over, the assessments that they're giving and why they're being put out there. And just kind of circling back a little bit there, you touched on it a bit, but I'm always thinking about all of these tools are great. There's many ed tech tools, but how do we choose? And I think in the same vein, there's also just so much data. We're in this information age. And so it's not always actionable. And so just if you could elaborate a little bit on that and as to how we can really support teachers with just the massive amounts of data, any ways that tools can really support teachers with that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a big question, but let's say just to take it down to like a micro level, I'm in a classroom, I'm delivering a lesson. I'm trying to, let's say I have an IWU structure and there's like something I want to communicate. I want to land a point and make sure, this is the key, is that make sure everybody understands this. Cause like, if you don't understand, what a thesis is, I'm about to ask you to write a thesis. And I want to make sure that you're ready to do that. Because if I tell you, okay, take a look at this article and tell me, what's your argument? Do you agree with blank? And then I release you to go do that, and we're not aligned on what I'm asking you to do, then it's going to be chaos and disengagement and so on. So what in that moment, like, that's formative assessment, and that you can do this as with most things. Well, some things, let's say AI aside, you can do these things on paper, right? Like there are ways you could do this manually. And a lot of great products have actually been born of um, processes that were unscalable, unsustainable, but a human could do. It was a human that originally was thinking like, I'm going to do this. So like, just finding a way to sort of effectively, like, what would I take as proof that my students are ready to go write a thesis? It's probably not raise your hand if you know what a thesis is, right? Like, that's much too shallow. Like, it's very easy for a student to just raise their hand and be like, I think, everyone else is raising their hand. So that's not enough. Write me a thesis and I will read it and I will tell you if it's a thesis. That's what I'm about to ask you to do. So I'm not really ready to ask you to do that. I want you to go do that, but I need to know if you're ready. So like, I need to find something in the middle that will give me a sense of like, your readiness for the next thing. And this isn't at the level of like gobs of data. This is just at the level of like, in the next 3 minutes, should I proceed or should I reteach or should I like mix it up and have students work in small groups, try to vary this. Like there's I think it was a physics professor, Eric Mazer at Harvard, who did a lot of really innovative work around just how to make a lecture more interactive. And a lot of it was just like pairing students and having them argue out their answers, so that he could get a sense of where they were in the lecture and they're following along in what he was teaching. And he was doing this, with hundreds of students, and eventually, created clickers and so on. But it's not a fundamentally technical process or digital process. That's just enabling like a pedagogical need.
Yeah, I've never really questioned why the turn and talk stopped in college, but they're definitely effective and enjoyable even as an adult when I'm sitting in a meeting or something of that sort. And I definitely think that to each of these places, there's so much that can be done to kind of supports teachers in really enabling them to help their students just be engaged and feel in that sense that they're ready. I think some of the best advice I got as a teacher was when, the teacher that one of the teachers I was training under really, really ingrained in me that when I was preparing a lesson, I needed to focus on what mastery sounded like from a student voice. So I might know the main takeaway of the lesson, but that wasn't necessarily in student vocabulary or even how they might phrase it. And I think when you're mentioning, understanding if a student's ready to write a thesis, it's about knowing what the mastery sounds like at that level, that it's not going to sound the same at the end of the day or the unit or the year. And so just keeping that in mind is really important. And there's so many different ways that we can support teachers with that. I could talk, I feel like I could be talking to you all day. And so I will try not to do that, but I wanted to just continue looking for and future forward and kind of think about as you go into thinking about K12 district leaders, many of whom may be hesitant about adopting new technologies, specifically AI technology, but just new products in general. I know that you've had quite a bit of experience in advising on some of those choices, but in your past. But how can K12 district leaders really make sure that they're moving forward and really kind of start small with some of those technology choices, but also aim large?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it's sort of an exciting question. I think first and foremost, you need to pilot and incubate in your own context. So it's not enough just to go to conferences and to hear others and to sort of to listen. You have to do that, but that's not enough. You have to have you have to be experimenting in a deliberate way in your own district in some form. Like New York City had the iZone years and years ago. There are ways that even the biggest, whatever you think of New York City DOE, biggest systems can do this. And it could be as simple as like finding a teacher who's in a stable place in their career, has the capacity, they're not experiencing other stuff, they can take on something, and sitting with them or asking them to come to you with a proposal, like what are some of the biggest assumptions or the hypotheses that you have about the usefulness of a technology in a given use case. I think this will be good for this purpose. And like, what's the cheapest experiment you could run that would, if you plot on like a 2x2, like what's our level of confidence and what's the consequence if we're wrong? And how can we test the thing that has the highest consequence. Like, we're going to release this to 50,000 kids, but we're really unsure about blank. And we really don't know the answer. Like, our confidence is low. So you got to test that thing that you think you may at one point release to 50,000 kids. You got to test it early in a very cheap way, like the smallest size you can think of. That's the kind of experimental thinking that you need to have happening somewhere in your district, so that you're incubating things and not just trying to bring in whole hog, like transplant an entire process from another district that you've heard about at a conference, because they've done a lot of work. Every single time they've done a lot of work in their own context. So you need to find a way to do that. And at the same time, you have to recognize that like the incremental steps you're taking are in the face of like a tectonic shift, in which AI is going to be smarter than humans, like soonish. So there's something looming. So you got to get going, and you can't be distracted by it, but you have to just be aware that like the norm here is a pace of change and a space that I don't think any of us really understands.
Yeah, and I think that's that's the role that leaders can take, is being that future forward, but then connecting and supporting the people that are on the ground. And I think that your ideas there really make the case for providing additional leadership roles for experienced teachers. I think that that's on a greater level something that can be challenging. Not every amazing teacher wants to be a school administrator. They might really want to stay in the classroom. And so creating additional leadership opportunities for those types of teachers, I think this is definitely a really good opportunity for that. So I love that you're encouraging leaders to lean into that.
Yeah, I think that's key. I think that like look to the resources that you have, build on the strengths that you have, and don't rush to import a technology. It's very hard. I think the districts that are best at this have spent a lot of time building resilient, dynamic systems around the people that they have, into which they can put technology. But it's often because if something fails, it's not because the technology necessarily caused it to fail. It's just because the district managing change is difficult, and they haven't figured out the right methods to do that. And technology is a form of change. So I think this generally probably applies not just to AI or technology, but to any initiative that you want to do, we think has room to grow to scale across your community.
Definitely. No, I mean, yeah, technology is definitely always brings on a lot of change. So I think that's a good place to be really mindful of that. Dan, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think that I've learned a lot, and I hope that anyone out there listening also, I'm sure that they've learned a lot as well. But we really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Olivia. Really enjoyed it.